Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and buonasera to those of you who are following us from Italy. Thank you for joining this webinar. I would like first of all to thank Dr. Sheryl Reese for having accepted our invitation and for proposing us such a stimulating take on Raphael life and work. Thank you to Dr. Lia Markey, Director of the Newberry Library Center for Renaissance Studies, for co-organizing and for introducing and moderating this webinar. Today's event is the last of a series of lectures inaugurated this past spring dedicated to Raphael on the 500th anniversary from the artist's death and jointly organized by the Italian Cultural Institutes in North America. None of us would have ever imagined to experience what we have experienced throughout the past 9 months. Nonetheless, I'm particularly glad to mention how we, my colleagues and me, how we've been able to put our energy together, creating such a fruitful synergy and offer this wide and multifaceted program dedicated to Raphael to all our followers and audiences across the continent. Therefore, in a geographical order, going from south to north, I would like to thank my colleagues, the directors of the Italian Cultural Institutes in North America, Valeria Rumori in Los Angeles, Anna Maria Di Giorgio in San Francisco, Emanuele Amendola in Washington, D.C., Paolo Barlera in New York City, Alessandro Ruggera in Toronto, and Francesco Darelli in Montreal. And before leaving the floor to our guests, I would like to remind that this webinar will be streamed live on the Italian Cultural Institute in Chicago Facebook page, and it will be recorded and soon will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. At the end, there will be a Q&A session moderated by Dr. Markey. And during the presentation, of course, as you probably already know, you can type your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And now I would like to leave the floor to our guests and speakers, Dr. Markey and Dr. Reese. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luca. It's been a pleasure collaborating with you on the planning of this event. I look forward to many future collaborations between the Newberry and the Istituto Italiano di Cultura of Chicago. It's wonderful that Chicago is part of the Raphael celebrations of 2020. I'm excited to introduce you to Sheryl Reese, who is Chicago's very own expert on Raphael. Sheryl received her PhD from Princeton University and is a scholar in residence at the Newberry Library. She also teaches for the Graham School of the University of Chicago, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and the University Club of Chicago. Previously, she's taught at Mount Holyoke College, Smith College, Cornell University, the University of California, Riverside, and the University of Southern California. Dr. Reese is a specialist in Italian Renaissance art and architecture with particular interest in the history of patronage. She's also interested in women and gender, archaism in early modern art, exchange between Italy and Northern Europe, and funerary art. She's the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships from the Crest Foundation and the NEH, just to name a few. And she's published widely on Italian art and art patronage of the early 16th century, focusing particularly on the patronage of members of the Medici family and on Raphael and Michelangelo. Along with several other Raphael specialists, she is the co-organizer of a conference titled Reconsidering Raphael, sponsored by Vassar College, which will take place in April 2021. So please mark your calendar. Dr. Reese has co-edited 2 books, Beyond Isabella, Secular Women, Patrons of Art in Renaissance Italy, and the Pontificate of Clement VII. And she's currently preparing a book on Pope Clement VII as patron of art. So today, Sheryl will present on Raphael and the ladies. And before I turn it over to her, I just want to remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will have a bit of time for questions at the end of her talk, and I will make sure to look at them there. Thanks so much, Sheryl, for joining us. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. I would like to start off with some thank yous as well. To Luca Di Vito, the director of the Italian Cultural Institute in Chicago, for inviting me to do this, for Lia Markey, director of Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry, for working with me and some others about doing something for the Raphael year. And I would like to thank some of my Raphaelesque group of women who have been working on Raphael for many years, talking about Raphael. And this includes Linda Wilkes-Simon, Yvonne Alette, Kim Butler, Tracy Cosgriff, and Alexis Culota. The presentation I'm going to be giving today is a kind of a fusion of two interests of mine, the interest in Raphael, which is very long-standing, and the interest in women patrons. And they're beginning to kind of come together here. And the work I'm doing today could not be done without the work of many people who have worked on this topic. And I just want to single out a few of them: Alison Lux, Donal Cooper, Tom Henry, Alberto Maria Sartore, and I want to make a special mention of Ms. Daisy Adams, who is doing a PhD on networks of women patrons in Perugia for the University of Texas in Austin. So let me go ahead here. I've had the pleasure of listening to many of the wonderful webinars done through the Italian Cultural Institutes, not only of Chicago, but my thanks to obviously to the other institutes in North America. In one of them in particular, my colleague Davide Gasparotto from the Getty Museum in Los Angeles gave a wonderful talk about Raphael's development and about his Madonnas. And I am showing here a beautiful Raphael Madonna that I knew for many years in the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena in California, and the great Sistine Madonna of about 1512 or so that is in Dresden. In the course of his talk, Davide Gasparotto mentioned in passing the kind of very special affinity Raphael seems to have for women. And he was speaking of this in terms of representation, in terms of how Raphael represented women with great sensitivity. And this was noticed by Raphael's contemporaries as well. So for example, the great biographer of Italian Renaissance artist Giorgio Vasari wrote in the 1568 edition of his Lives of the Most Eminent Painters and Sculptors that Raphael had the ability to impart, the imparting of life and beauty to the heads of women. And I am illustrating this point here with the beautiful portrait of a young woman with a unicorn of about 1505 in Rome in the Galleria Borghese, which was used to illustrate this lecture and may possibly involve the patronage of a woman I will be talking about, and the incomparably beautiful so-called Donna Vallata of about 1514 during Raphael's Roman period. And so he had this great sensitivity in how he depicted women. And this carries over also to his depictions of female nudes. And I show you here the fresco of the Triumph of Galatea from 1511, and a red chalk drawing done around 1517-18 in preparation for the frescoes of the Villa Farnesina that belongs to Agostino Chigi. Raphael clearly loved women. Raphael clearly looked at women and women's bodies. And what I'm going to be talking about today is how Raphael appealed to women patrons, collectors, and viewers. Slightly different topic than representation. And just to remind you that in his 1557 Dialogo della pittura intitolato L'Aretino, Ludovico Dolce said, Raphael painted his women with that delicacy that belongs to their sex. And so this was part of the art theory of the 16th century, recognizing this special affinity that Raphael had for depictions of women. Now, I want to say a few words about how gender, the study of gender and women, can intersect with the study of patronage. The patronage of art is inherently interdisciplinary, and it brings together the study, obviously, of art and of art history, but also social and political history, of anthropology, psychology, and economics, really to understand how works of art come about and how their appearance may be due, at least in part, to the role of the patrons. In the talk today, I'll be adding additional layers to this sort of Venn diagram or near Venn diagram here. And that is the role of gender in patronage and also the role of usage and viewership. Because it's very important to understand that even if a woman was not necessarily the patron in the sense of the person who made the payments, the person whose name is on the contract, very often works of art in this period were intended also to be viewed by women, to be cared for by women. And it's probably to be assumed in many of these cases that women had input in the works of art that were commissioned and sometimes realized, sometimes not realized. And I would draw your attention in particular to the work of Roger Crumb on this issue and also of Stephanie Solom, who have discussed what might be called indirect patronage, where the wishes of women and the viewing habits of women come into the picture, even if they are not the ones who, so to speak, wrote the checks. And that is paraphrasing an article of Roger Crumb's. So all of these complex issues come into how one can understand women patrons of Raphael. So I want to start out looking at some works done early in Raphael's career. In those years, he is described already as a master in a contract in the year 1500 when he is around 17 years old. In his early years, he was active in a couple of cities in Umbria, in the center of Italy, in particular Perugia, and Città di Castello here, close to the Tuscan border. He came from Urbino, which is over here. It's off the map. You'll see a map of it a little bit later. Although his activity as a painter for the court of Urbino tends to postdate some work that he did here in Umbria. So this is really just to orient you to the parts of Italy that we will be talking about. So I want to go to Perugia. I want to start out in Perugia, and I want to take a look here at an altarpiece, which was done for the Franciscan nuns of the Church of Sant Antonio of Padua in the city of Perugia. This is a reconstruction on the right that comes from Linda Wolk-Simon's wonderful book on the Colonna altarpiece. As you can see, it had a lunette, a main square panel that you see here, and predella and representations here of saints at the corners with a kind of architectural frame. And it was intended for the inner church of the Church of Sant Antonio. I'm not going to get into some of the issues of dating and the sort of stylistic issues with the painting, which I will leave for other people. I want to, however, draw your attention to a passage in the 1568 edition of Vasari's Lives. In the Lives, he says, the nuns of Sant Antonio of Padua in the same city, and that's Perugia, employed him to paint a Madonna with a clothed Christ, as was pleasing to those simple and venerable women. He's pointing out here that the figure of the Christ child here is fully clothed, and he's making an association with female viewership and a female audience for sort of an anomaly in Raphael's art to depict the Christ child clothed. Now, this has sometimes been looked at a way of sort of impeding Raphael's genius. I tend to look at it more as a marketing strategy. Raphael, if anything, was someone who was very concerned with shaping a reputation for himself as a young man and creating what we might call a market share for himself. And it, in these early years in particular, many of his patrons were in fact female, as we will be discussing. So here again is the beautiful Norton Simon Madonna from about 1502, 1503 or so. And as you can see, the Christ child is fully nude. Now, some of you may have read an extremely important book by the late art historian Leo Steinberg, which talks about the sexuality of representations of Christ in the Renaissance, and who very convincingly for most people attributes the rise of depictions of the Christ child as a nude figure to concerns with making manifest that in fact he lived as a human in the incarnation. Now, it has often been mentioned that the clothed figure of the Christ child over here in his mother's lap is similar to a number of works done by the Umbrian artist who also worked in Rome, Pinturicchio. And Pinturicchio kind of went back and forth. There are representations of nude, representations of the Christ child nude in Pinturicchio's work, and then there are others that are clothed, such as this somewhat randomly selected example in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where I thought it looked nice with the Christ child reading over here in the Norton Simon Madonna. And so Raphael, from his earliest works that represented the Christ child, did depict the Christ child nude. And so this is an anomaly in his work. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the gendering of oil paint and the gendering of implicitly of Raphael as gendered female in art writing and art criticism of the 16th century. And I want to quote a couple of authors who purport to be quoting Michelangelo, who was very much the embodiment of the manly artist in the 16th century. And here I am much indebted to the work in particular of Philip Sohm on gendered attitudes toward oil painting, and also to the work of Laura Agustin on Francisco de Holanda. Francisco de Holanda was actually a Portuguese painter who spent time in Rome, and he wrote a book on painting, which was published in Lisbon in 1548. And in a very famous passage, Holanda presents a situation in which Michelangelo is speaking to the pious widow and very close friend of his, Vittoria Colonna. And there's a long passage on the nature of Flemish painting, which is pretty derogatory about painting from north of the Alps. And it also has gendered aspects. And so Francisco de Holanda has Michelangelo, whom you see over here, saying to Vittoria Colonna, "The painting of Flanders, Signora," the painter answered slowly, "will appeal to women, especially the very old or the very young, and likewise to monks and nuns." And so here Holanda is making an association with primarily female viewership and Northern Renaissance painting. Giorgio Vasari recounts in both editions of his lives, 1550 and 1568, an episode in which the Venetian painter Sebastiano del Piombo, who had been a kind of mortal enemy of Raphael during the pontificate of Pope Leo X. The story Vasari tells is that Sebastiano del Piombo was urging Michelangelo to paint the Last Judgment, which you see here on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, in oils rather than in true fresco, which is what Michelangelo had always used and used up here in the ceiling and in the lunettes of the Sistine Chapel, which he painted earlier in the century. Vasari says that basically they got into such a imbroglio about this, because Michelangelo wanted to paint in true fresco, not in oils, that it ended their relationship, which had been very close for many years. And what Vasari has Michelangelo say, again, is that the coloring in oils was arte da donna, women's art, And so there is this gendering of oil painting using oils as female. Now, in part, this is certainly aimed at the practice in Venice in particular, but Raphael, at least in a central Italian context, who painted in oils and who sometimes used very Venetian-like techniques in passages of his paintings, becomes a kind of a stand-in. And we know that Michelangelo loathed and despised Raphael. He was complaining about him 22 years after Raphael's death, saying that Raphael got everything he had from him, from Michelangelo. And so this loathing of oil painting and its gendering as female can probably be extended to Raphael again. And this is something that is mentioned in some 16th century art theory. And again, I am indebted to Philip Sohm for his work on this topic. So Raphael gendered female, oil painting gendered female. I want to now move to Città di Castello and then to Urbino and look at examples of early works by Raphael that were either commissioned directly by women, sometimes with the intervention of men, or that we must assume had female viewers who may have had input into their husbands' commissions for these paintings. And I want to start by looking at a couple of his very early works. At the left is a fragment of the mostly destroyed St. Nicholas of Tolentino altarpiece, contracted in 1501. The few remaining pieces are scattered in museums in Naples and Paris and in Brescia in northern Italy. And the patron was a man whose name was Andrea Baronci. From slightly later, also done for Città di Castello and for kind of class of wealthy patrons who all knew each other, the Mond Crucifixion, which is in London in the National Gallery. And the documented patron is named Domenico Gavardi. Now, what's important is to understand that these two families interacted. There were intermarriages in these families. And in fact, the wife of one of these men made the other man her universal heir. And very interestingly, her will was actually signed at the foot of this altar where this altarpiece was installed. And so while the wives of Baronci and Gavardi were not patrons in the direct sense, that is, of signing the contracts, they were certainly users and viewers. And we obviously have documented evidence that one of the women really was right in front of this painting when signing her will. There were many places in Italy and types of women where women couldn't even act directly on their own, couldn't sign contracts on their own, and had to have male representation. And so all of these things come into trying to understand what the role of women may have been, both as active patrons or as users and indeed as stewards of some of these works of art. Now I want to go back to Perugia now, where we started out with the Colonna altarpiece. And I want to look at a couple of other altarpieces done for a church in Perugia called San Francesco al Prato, which you see over here. And I want to talk a little bit about a network of interrelated women. Now, in the 16th century, Perugia was kind of fraught with internecine street gang violence, in particular between two families, the Baglioni family and the Odi family, and yet these families often intermarried. And this certainly helps us to understand networks of female women who knew each other and who seemed to help to foster the career of the young Raphael. So here is Raphael's coronation of the Virgin, also known as the Palo Odi, which is in the Vatican today. And the patron was a woman whose name is Leandra de Jodi. It's sometimes called Alessandra de Jodi in some documents. And this was commissioned, as I mentioned, for San Francesco al Prato, which was a Franciscan church, as you see it, as how it looks today. Now, here is a genealogical tree that was put together by Miss Daisy Adams, the PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin, whom I mentioned. And I just wanted to look sort of in this area of the genealogical tree to see some of the women who acted as patrons. Here is Leandra Baglioni de Odi, so born Baglioni, married into the Odi clan, who was the patron of the coronation of the Virgin that we just looked at. Here is her sister-in-law, Atalanta Baglioni, whom we're going to look at next. Here is Atalanta's son, Grifonetto, who was killed in 1500 in this kind of violence that really shook the streets of Perugia in the late 15th, early 16th century. This woman here, Ilaria, who was a nun, has also been associated with patronage, possibly of the Colonna altarpiece, as a matter of fact. And so my thanks very much to Daisy Adams here for this, and we all look forward to her dissertation, where she's going to delve deeply into the questions of these networks of female patronage in Perugia among these two families in particular. So most of Raphael's early altarpieces stylistically were relatively conservative, reflecting first the influence of his study with his late father, Giovanni Santi, a court painter at the court of Urbino, who died in 1494 when Raphael was about 11. And then certainly the study of the artist Perugino, who was by far the most popular and successful painter in Umbria in the early years of the 16th century. Around 1504, Raphael moved to Florence, although he was very peripatetic and he spent time in Urbino and Perugia as well, in what is usually called his Florentine period, starting in 1504. There he studied the art of Leonardo da Vinci, he studied the art of Michelangelo, he studied antique art, sarcophagi that he would have been able to see in nearby Pisa. And in 1507, he painted this dramatic altarpiece for a female patron, and let me just go back, for Atalanta Baglioni, whom you see here. Also for the Church of San Francesco al Prato, where she had patronage rights to a chapel. Now in 1500, her son was involved in a plot and ended up being murdered. And Atalanta Baglioni had actually shunned her son, had turned him away, and then was pretty well racked with grief over the death of her son, whom she turned away before he was murdered because he killed his uncle, which she wasn't happy about. This altarpiece, as you can see here, represents the Christ being carried to his rock-cut tomb that you see here, surrounded by both male and female figures. And I draw your attention here to the figure of Mary Magdalene and here to the figure of the Virgin Mary, who is depicted as swooning. And so this magnificent altarpiece, which is now beginning to reflect Raphael's study, for example, Michelangelo in the figure that you see over here and in the figure that you see over here, synthesized with his interest in landscape from studying with studying Northern European art, for example. And it all kind of comes together here in this altarpiece, which was done in 1507, the year before he then moves definitively to Rome to work at the papal court. Now, Raphael was very much an economic man, a man who was certainly considered concerned with money. This is certainly the case for Michelangelo as well. Michelangelo is very well documented in letters, whereas there are very few autograph letters or writings by Raphael himself. One of them, on the back of a drawing that he made for another artist whose name was Domenico Alfani, he put a note here, and on the note, he is reminding Alfani basically to get his money for the entombment. And so he writes here, again, I remind you to entreat Madonna Atalanta to send me the money. And so this is a major interest of Raphael, who really could be described in these years in Florence and Umbria and Urbino, sort of as a young man who was really, really seeking to advance his career. And the patronage of women really, really helped him realize that. So the subject matter here, as I mentioned, is the entombment, the carrying of Christ to the rock-cut tomb. But the evolution of this altarpiece is quite extraordinary in that we have a sequence of drawings, and I'm only going to show you 2 or 3 of those drawings, which show the evolution of Raphael's thoughts about this painting that he was working on. And it's, I think, probably to be assumed that there were propositions, proposed ideas presented to the patron, to Atalanta Baglioni, and that she had input in the evolution, the change from here, when you see Christ in a lamentation, his head in his mother's lap on the ground, to the more active, dynamic depiction of the entombment. And so a shift from lamentation on the ground to Christ actively being carried to the tomb. And here is one of the last drawings in that sequence that is squared for transfer and is very close to the final composition. And Raphael not only looked at Michelangelo and at Northern Renaissance landscapes for the entombment, he also looked at ancient sculpture representing the theme of the death of Meleager. Here is a Roman sarcophagus fragment in the Met, not necessarily the one that Raphael may have seen, but just to show you this composition of this hunter from Greek mythology who is killed in a hunt for a boar. And there is a connection to the patron here in that part of the myth of the Caledonian boar hunt involves a figure whose name is Atalanta. And so we can probably assume that Atalanta Baglioni, in a sense, identified with the myth of Meleager and may or may not have had input in the change to the treatment here of the carrying of the body of the dead Christ. Now, what's really important to understand is the prominence of women in this composition and the prominence given to female expressions of grief and emotion. And I want to here single out the work of Heather Graham, who has a forthcoming article, which I've had the pleasure of reading, about female emotion, about how female mourning rituals were regulated in the period and contravened, and in particular, how this painting really can embody for us the kinds of emotions that the passions that women felt at the death. And again, we are looking at a work of art commissioned by a grieving mother for the family burial chapel. And so here, a major change from earlier versions, such as you see here and here, is that the Virgin is now shown in a full swoon. collapsing into the arms of her female companions. There's another instance of female patronage in Perugia, a very interesting commission in which the poor Clares, these are Franciscan nuns of the convent of Santa Maria in Monteluce, commissioned the young Raphael in 1505 to paint them an altarpiece representing the coronation of the Virgin. They sought out opinions about an artist to hire to do this. And in a memoriale is a kind of a memoir book, if you will, of the convent of Monteluce, it was written that the best maestro was recommended by several citizens and also by our venerable fathers. These are the male priests who would enact business for the convent, who had seen his works and who called himself Master Raphael of Urbino. And so there is this kind of process here where the female patrons and their the mission for this painting unfolded over a full 20 years, from 1505 to 1525, when the nuns finally got their altarpiece. And there were contracts in 1505, 1516, 1520, which is lost, and again in 1523. It was completed by Raphael's heirs, Giulio Romano and Giovan Francesco Pegni, possibly using a remnant from an earlier composition. Documents found by Alberto Maria Sartore a few years ago do suggest that Raphael may have started painting on the panel. We know that he did drawings around the time of the 1516 commission, but basically once he went to Rome, he sort of blew off the nuns of Santa Maria in Monteluce, constantly, because of the tremendous amount of work he had working for Pope Leo X and the Curia and for kings and dukes, the nuns of Monteluce clearly got the short end of the stick, so to speak. So now I want to come to Urbino, the magical city here in the Marche in Italy. And so here is Umbria, and here is what is called the Marches in England. And this is where the young Raphael was born and was first educated by his late father, Giovanni Santi. Now, for Urbino, in the years that are normally called Raphael's Florentine period, and that would be 1504 until the spring of 1508, Raphael produced a number of paintings for the court of Urbino, small religious and secular subjects, some portraits, although some of them are disputed, such as the one that you see here, and also probably some designs for silver, things like that, the kind of things you might expect a court artist to be doing. And he was also commissioned to paint paintings that were given as gifts by members of the court, including female members of the court. And of course, it is at the court of Urbino that Baldassare Castiglione set his famous book of the Courtier. So one of those patrons was the Duchess, whose name was Elisabetta Gonzaga, whom you see here. And she was the patron of a small representation of the agony in the garden. This is when Christ is praying the night before the crucifixion. And the painting in question is now lost. And so I'm showing you instead a predella panel from the Colonna altarpiece, which is in New York, along with the main panel and the lunette. And I am showing you another painting here of St. George, which has been associated with patronage from Urbino. Now, the poet and later Cardinal Pietro Bembo wrote a letter on May 6th of 1507 on this lost agony of the garden, in the garden, which was commissioned by Elisabetta, by the Duchess, for a famously pious monk whose name was Don Michele Fiorentino. And in this letter, Bembo mentions what we would call the facture, the handling of the paint, how Raphael painted this lost agony in the garden. And Bembo says the quality of the workmanship, which is very delicate and minuto by a gran maestro of painting. And so this is in 1507, before Raphael goes to Rome. And this idea of delicate, of subtle, of fine handling, this is something that one really sees in these pictures that were painted for Urbino, most of which are quite small in context, and they actually almost look as if the paint has been airbrushed on the ones that are in good condition. This is an exception. This is from the predella, again, of a painting, a large altarpiece done for Perugia, but it probably gives us an idea of what this lost painting looked like, which was commissioned by a woman. And she says, in fact, in a letter of her own, that it was in memoria di me, because she was exchanging it with the monk for one of his rosaries. And so it's very personal. And although it was not painted for her own private devotion, she would have been the first viewer. She would have been the first person who saw it, who commissioned it, who asked Raphael to do it, and who presumably would have had to approve how it looks. Now, this idea of delicate and minuto brings me now to works done and the role of another woman in the Urbino court, whose name is Giovanna Felfia della Rovere. She was the wife of, no, let me change the order of that. She was the daughter of Federico da Montefeltro, famous Duke of Urbino. She was the sister of Guidobaldo della Rovere, the Duke of Urbino, who was married to the Duchess of Felfia, and the mother of Francesca Maria della Rovere, who will be adopted by Guidobaldo. And she was married to the brother of the future, well, the brother of Pope Julius II from the della Rovere family. And he was the prefect of Rome. And so she was generally called the prefettessa, the wife of the prefect, if you will. Raphael's beautiful painting La Muta of about 1507 to 8, now in Urbino, has sometimes been identified as a representation of Giovanna, who would have been in her 40s around the time this picture was painted, and by then a widow. And this brings me briefly, because it's really easy to get very caught up with this letter, to a letter that was published in 1754 by a Italian figure named Giovanni Gaetano Bottari. And this letter is often used to start off Raphael's so-called Florentine period. And the reason for this is that it is a letter of introduction in the name of Giovanna Felfia della Rovere that was written to the standard bearer for life of the Florentine Republic, the leader of the Florentine Republic, whose name was Piero Soderini. Now, this letter is extremely interesting in terms of its language. It's rather typical for letters of recommendation of the period, but there are linguistic and chronological issues with it. The letter was definitively placed in the category of fakes by John Sherman in his collection of early modern documents on Raphael. But there are other scholars, myself included, and I would name Tom Henry and Caroline Elam, and probably others, who at least would like to keep an open mind about this letter. So the letter, if there ever was one, that Bottari published in 1754 is gone. It's the Holy Grail. If somebody finds this letter, you know, they're going to be the most famous Raphael scholar out there. But I want to quote to you from the letter, which is indeed possibly a forgery. And Giovanna is said to write The bearer of this will be Raphael, painter of Urbino, who, being gifted in his profession, has determined to spend some time in Florence in order to learn, per imparare. And because his father, of whom I was, now this interpolation of mine in brackets is because in Bottari, it's in the present tense. And after Bottari published the letter, a document was found indicating that Giovanni Santi, in fact, had died in 1494 and was long dead, 10 years dead by the date that's given to this letter. I was very fond of your father, most worthy, and the son is a sensible and well-mannered young man. On both accounts, I bear him great love and desire him to attain perfection. Very Bessarian word there. Therefore, I recommend him to your lordship as earnestly as I can, entreating you for love of me, that for all of his exigencies, it will please you to render him every assistance and favor. And whatever such aids and courtesies and opportunities he may receive from your lordship, I shall regard as bestowed upon myself, and shall take from that my special gratitude. I commend and offer myself to your lordship at Urbino, 1st of October, 1504, and she signs it here using both her birth name and her marital name, Duchess of Sora, and prefectessa of the city, meaning of Rome. The issue of Raphael and manners is really important. It comes up in 16th century art theory as well. Ludovico Dolce says that he was naturally fond of politeness and delicacy, as he was himself remarkably polite and gentle in his manners. During his own lifetime, in fact, Raphael was singled out as the prince of painters. And what Vasari says about him is that he lived more like a prince than a painter. So I want to set aside this problematic letter and the issue of its authenticity, but it does bring into the discussion Giovanna Felfia della Rovere. And here is a letter, one of the rare examples of an autographed letter by Raphael. It's in the Vatican Library now, written to one of his uncles who was in Urbino. And he talks about lots of patrons and patronage situations in this letter about wanting to get an estimate for the value of an altarpiece. So again, we see here Raphael is sort of economic actor, if you will. But in the letter to his uncle Simone, he writes that he had talked to another uncle, to a maternal uncle who was a priest. And he says to Simone, I wrote the other day to ask if he, the other uncle, would send me a tavoletta, meaning a small little panel, that was the cover of Our Lady of the Prophetessa. The word is prophetessa, not prefetessa. And this is, again, a little bit tricky, but the general assumption is that this is what might be called a slip of the quill, if you will. In other words, that meaning not Our Lady of the Prophetess, but meaning Our Lady of a representation of the Madonna and Child of the prefetessa of Giovanna Feltria della Rovere. And so there have been attempts, a number of attempts to identify what this Madonna that was done, if it was done for Giovanna Feltria della Rovere, rather than being a representation of a kind of Sibylline Madonna who's like a female prophet. But one of the paintings that has been identified with the Our Lady mentioned in this letter is the small Cooper Madonna of 1505 that is now in Washington, D.C. in the National Gallery of Art. It certainly seems to come from an Urbino context, in that here in the background is a representation, slightly altered, of the Church of San Bernardino in Urbino, which becomes a kind of mausoleum for the Della Rovere and the Montefeltro family, rather. And so Urbino context, but it would be kind of hard to describe this as a tavoletta, the size of a tavoletta that had a cover. And that is why I include the dimensions here. It is about 23.6 inches by about 17 0.3 inches wide. I want to, for a couple of reasons here, propose another candidate for the letter, the representation of the Madonna and Child mentioned in the April 1508 letter. And that is the exquisite jewel-like and very tiny Madonna of the Pinks that is now in the National Gallery in London. And it is much smaller. Unfortunately, the Zoom screen is completely covering up my dimensions in inches. I don't know if it's doing that for you, but in centimeters, this is about 27.9 by 22.4 centimeters. So under 3 feet, more or less. And here you kind of get a feeling of the size for it relative to the heads of these various viewers. So why do I think that the Madonna of the Pinks may have been done for Giovanna Felfia della Rovere? One of the reasons is its scale. We know that we're talking about a small painting that was done for her, as long as we accept the word privatessa rather than prophetessa. Secondly, the handling of the paint. When I saw the picture, having not seen it for quite a few years, and I saw it again in San Diego when it visited the Timken Museum there, I walked into the room and was just blown away by how tiny and delicate it is. And I want you to think of the words in 1507, around the same time that Pietro Bembo used to describe the painting that was commissioned by Elisabetta Gonzaga as delicate and tiny. And so that's part of the reason I think that this may have been done for an Urbino context. Vasari actually says it was done for a woman patron, but identifies it as having been done for one of the women in Perugia. But then there's another reason I think that this may have been done for a female patron. And that is because here in the window, we see a representation of a column or a colonnette that is clearly using the Ionic Order. And I want to thank my friend and colleague Linda Wolk-Simon, who identified this detail in a talk that she gave at the Timken Museum in San Diego 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago. And when she said that, a little bell went off in my head, going back to Vitruvius. Vitruvius, the author of the only surviving architectural treatise to survive from antiquity. And Vitruvius says about the orders, or about columns, he says, thus in the invention of the two different kinds of columns, they borrowed manly beauty, naked and unadorned for the one, that's the Doric order, and for the other, the delicacy, adornment, and proportions characteristic of women. Elsewhere, Vitruvius says that the Ionic Order is associated with matrons. And again, around this time, around 1506, 1507, Giovanna Feltria della Rovere would have been a widow at this time, but certainly would have been a mature woman. So in the absence of a document, I can't prove that the Madonna of the Pinks was done for a woman or can be associated with the Madonna of the Privatessa that is in the 1508 letter, but I do want to encourage you to think about that possibility. Some years ago, Sir Timothy Clark did associate the painting with Urbino, but didn't go as far as trying to identify a particular patron. I want to make a point of Raphael sort of varying his style and the kinds of works he produced due to the patronage and marketing situations in different places where he was active. And so for Urbino, these small, minute, delicate works, for Perugia and Città di Castello, these large public altarpieces that tended to be rather more conservative in their artistic language, the entombment being an exception. Now, I have probably about a couple minutes left to me, so I want to go rather quickly here. I'm going to really just very, very quickly say that when he was in Florence, Raphael was not really able to crack into the altarpiece market, and he did mostly paintings of the Madonna and Child for domestic settings, for wealthy, wealthy aristocrats who tended to be friends, who tended to intermarry. One of them was named Taddeo Taddei, who is mentioned in the 1508 letter, a patron also of Michelangelo. Another was a family named Doni, whom Raphael painted portraits of here, and for whom Michelangelo around 1505, 1506 did the famous Doni Tondo. And these patrons, there were intermarriages among them. They were present at events for their various families. And again, while it seems that the works of art were commissioned in terms of paying the checks by men, it seems that the women certainly would have been very important in both viewing the works and expressing opinions for things like the choice of the artist, subject matter, things like that. Now, I'm going to very quickly rush on, so I finish close to on time. And I'll say that I have suggested elsewhere that it may have been Giovanna Felfia della Rovere who recommended Raphael to her brother-in-law, Pope Julius II. He said she was pazza. He said that she was kind of crazy, by the way. So he moves to Rome in 1508, and the patronage situation changes dramatically. He's now a court artist, again, working for the Curia, for the papal court, and the lion's share of the patronage he enjoyed in Rome was from men, and also the lion's share of the audience, although women could come into parts of the Vatican Palace, but not all. He kept basically putting off the nuns of the Monteluce coronation and signed a new contract in 1516 and may have done a small amount of work before his untimely death in April of 1520. He also did paint for a woman painter or owner, the Santa Cecilia altarpiece, which was sent to Bologna, and which the musicologist Robert Kendrick talked about so beautifully in another one of these webinars. But now, very quickly, I just want to shift gears a little bit and look at women who collected works by Raphael and how they may have seen them and viewed them. And I'm only going to very quickly give you a couple of examples. One of them is a painting that in 1595 and again in 1597 was described as being in the collection of a very virtuous and pious widow whose name was Caterina Nobili Sforza, who is known as an architectural patron of Counter-Reformation architecture in Rome, in particular the wonderful church of San Bernardo alle Terme of 1598. In 1597, an agent of the Duke of Mantua wrote to the Duke saying that he had seen this painting in the collection of the Duchess and that she didn't want to sell it. And it's described as a half-length nude Venus with black hair and eyes, on the left arm of which, in a bracelet, is written Raphael Urbinus. And so we have this very interesting and paradoxical situation where a woman who is famed for her piety and for her patronage of religious art and architecture, here is the owner of one of the most erotically charged paintings of the 16th century, and certainly that Raphael ever painted. And so this helps us to kind of have a more nuanced understanding of women and how they looked at things. Now, by the early 17th century, we know that the Fornarina was kept behind shutters, and it has been posited, in fact, that the covering of the erotic image actually goes back to the days of Raphael, but we can't document that. Now I want to very quickly cross the ocean and move ahead 400 some years in time to Gilded Age Boston. And here we're looking at the left at a John Singer Sargent portrait of the great collector Isabella Stewart Gardner, who obsessed about wanting to have a Raphael. So in her correspondence with Bernard Berenson, who was a connoisseur and one of her art advisors, she already owned a Raphael, which we're going to see in a moment, but she obsessed, she just desperately wanted to own a Madonna by Raphael. And she wrote to Berenson in March of 1901 saying, and buy me a heavenly Raphael Madonna. And that's her italics there. And then let's go to sleep on our laurels. She was offered the chance to purchase the Colonna altarpiece with which we started the talk today, but Berenson strongly encouraged her not to do it in 1897. He was very, very negative about its condition, about its authorship. Big mistake, sorry. So the Met got that. But in 1900, Mrs. Gardner did purchase one of the predella panels from the Colonna altarpiece, this beautiful representation of the Pietà or Lamentation. She still, even after getting this Raphael and a portrait as well, wanted desperately to have a Raphael Madonna. And in 1902, she wrote to Berenson, my remaining pennies must go to the greatest Raphael, nothing short of that. I have tasted blood, you see. And she actually fashioned herself in a sense after the great female Renaissance patron, Isabella d'Este, who herself talked about her insatiable desire for antiquities. And so you have these women, this picture of them as just being rapacious collectors. But she did get the beautiful Pietà from the Colonna altarpiece. Nearly 4 centuries after it was painted for devout female nuns. And this American woman in Boston would come to own a work by the Prince of Painters that resulted from the patronage of women. In this case, not for its devotional efficacy, as for the nuns of Sant'Antonio in Padua, but instead for its status of a work of art by Raphael. Thank you. Okay. Uh-oh, can't hear. You're mute.
Thank you, Cheryl, for this wonderful talk, weaving together works of art, incredible documentation about Raphael. And it's fascinating to see how personal interests are truly intertwined with so many of these commissions. We have some questions, and I want to urge you all to put your questions in the box at the bottom of your screen, if you have some, and we will try to get to them as soon as we can. While I'm gathering questions, I thought I would just start off by asking you to talk a little bit more. I mean, I'm wondering if you feel comfortable making a specific claim about works commissioned by women by Raphael. Do you feel that you can make a statement about them being significantly different from other works commissioned by men? Is this not something you want to think about? The term conservative came up a couple times in relationship, especially to the metropolitan work commissioned by nuns.
Right.
I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Well, I think there are issues of subject matter, of handling, and of viewership. And so, for example, for the Urbino context, women were important. That's one of the things that we see in Castellane. I would go far out on a limb to say that female taste for the delicate, for the pretty, for the minute had an impact. But again, you have men talking to women, you have women commissioning things for men, and vice versa. For the case of things born, in particular for the presence of the clothed Christ child and female reception, that is related quite directly to their being modest. And so I think that that is not a matter of the handling of paint or the style so much as it is for female sensibilities. And certainly along with Heather Graham and others, I would see in the evolution of the Baglioni entombment, exploring different ways of presenting female grief and mourning, which was such a huge issue because many cities, of course, had limits on the how much emotion women could express at funerals and things like that. And so, yes, that said, these women had to negotiate being in a world of men. Many of them had to have male intervention. For example, the Santa Cecilia altarpiece, the female recipient had a male, Antonio Pucci, who did the commission itself, but it was clearly done for her, keeping her in mind. And this is where this goes to this whole idea of indirect patronage and viewership, so that you may not have the contract that says that Giovanna Feltria della Rovere pays 50 ducats or whatever to Maestro, whatever, but these people saw each other and they talked to each other, and that's probably as far out on the limb as I'm going to go.
Okay, I think that makes sense. And I think this concept of indirect patronage is fascinating. We do have quite a few questions now. Gilbert Jones asked 2 questions, which I think are somewhat interrelated. He says, "Hi, Cheryl, this is a fantastic talk and wonderful topic. And I wonder if you might be able to elaborate on the stemma on the sleeve of Christ's tunic and the colonna altarpiece." I personally know that Linda Wilkes-Simon has published on this, but he wonders if there's a connection to the nuns as patron. And then another question from him, the Mond crucifixion, do we know where the work was originally installed? If it is, was it in a private home? Would it have been domestic chapel?
No, it's a large public, public altarpiece in Città di Castello. So yeah, and it's big. It's definitely big. And scale is another one of these things. I mean, nobody likes to think that everything done for women is small and pretty and delicate, or that female artists are small and pretty and delicate, but there does seem to have been a certain kind of taste. As for the stemma, actually, I'm completely blanking on that. It's not something that I noted down or thought about. I think it may well be in Linda's book from 2006 and went by me. Maybe Linda can answer it in the Q&A if she knows, but so I don't actually know. An Italian scholar in 1987, I think, proposed what Linda says, pattern on sleeve of Christ child not known to have any meaning or significance, just decorative. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Linda. Here we are assuming. Yeah.
So I completely lost my train of thought. You're tired. Yeah. So what was the other part of Gilbert's question? I
think you already answered it. And actually we have a lot of other interesting questions here related to economics. Maria Sofiati Dale asks, were women allowed to pay the artists for their commissions directly? And then related to that, Pooja Kungar writes, did money come to the women from inheritance money, their husbands? For instance, with the Bostonian woman, with Isabella Stewart Gardner, was she independently financed? That's so questions about finance in the Renaissance and then more recently.
And about Boston. I am not such an expert, obviously, on Boston. She was married to a wealthy man, and I would have to double check if she were also independently wealthy. To go back to the Renaissance that I know a little bit more about, in part because there are these different classes of women. There's so many different classes of women. They were talking about nuns, noblewomen, aristocratic young brides and things like that. The circumstances of their access to money tended to differ from place to place and tended to differ according to their situation. Now, one of the reasons patronage was often done by widows is because once they were widows, widows would come into they would get their hands on their dowry, even though their married families sometimes tried to fight that. So we see a lot of patronage by women, We see a number of men who in their wills will ask women to commission chapels and altarpieces, and obviously prayers and candles in their memories. The situation for court women, like the court of Urbino, would be quite different from a young bride, and thinking, for example, of Maddalena Strozzidoni, who came from one of Florence's wealthiest families, but the family was kind of in sort of hot water at that point for political reasons. The Raphael 1504 to 1508 was in Florence in the period of the Medici exile. And so the Medici were not available then as patrons. And so the access of a young bride to her family, her natal family money or dowry money would be very different from the kind of money that someone like an Isabella d'Este or an Elisabetta Gonzaga may have had, where there actually would have been allotments for things like this. So I think it's really kind of a case by case, place by place sort of basis. And I think also it's important to bear in mind that in some places, women simply could not sign a document. They simply had to have a male protector in a certain sense who would do those things. So again, it's kind of case by case, place to place.
We have two interesting, very specific questions that I think are worth touching on, and then I will end with a more general question for conclusion.
Sure.
Ralph Kidno says, hello, sends his best from Munster, and he just wants to talk a little bit more about the Meleager sarcophagus and its relationship to the Baglione painting. And he writes, isn't it possible that this was Raphael's idea to change it to Atalanta? Raphael, knowing Alberti and Meleager sarcophagus, made a compliment to the All'Antica.
Well, and to the patron as well.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I mean, we don't have tape recordings of conversations. We don't know. And we, in many of these cases, you simply have to assume that there was back and forth. And so, yes, absolutely. But I think it's kind of complex, and I think you can't, in the absence of a specific document saying, and, you know, Madonna Atalanta, who has identified with the myth of Atalanta, requested this or not. I think in a broader, more general sense, however, that Raphael was extremely sensitive to the grief here of a female patron, and is exploring it psychologically in ways that we just don't see to the same extent in many other paintings from the period.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful depiction of emotion there, female emotion. So two questions about the fascinating Giovanna Feltria di Rovere letter. Graziella Macchetta wants to know more about why it's thought to be a forgery, and then Alison Lukes wants you to talk a little bit more about the connection between La Muta and Giovanna.
Just quickly, it's simply because it's an Urbino painting with an Urbino history. And I think it's just one of those things where people have, I don't know how far back the suggestions go. I would have to look that up. To my knowledge, there are not any firm documented representations of her, which is rather strange given her sort of lineage and pedigree. So I don't know how far, when that identification was first made. I think it's primarily because it's a picture out of an Urbino context, and somewhat middle-aged sitter, certainly not very young like the young woman with the unicorn, who's been identified, by the way, as Laura Orsini by Linda Wolk Simon. And the other question?
The other question was specifically about the relationship between La Muta and Giovanna.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of those things where people have said this is an Urbino picture. She was a famous member of the
final question, yes. I thought a final question comes from Maria Proti, and maybe this is something that many of us are thinking about. She asks just very simply, did Raphael have women friends? And I know that's a huge question, and what sort of documentation do we have for that? But I think that might be an interesting way to conclude and to think about what was his relationship with women, what sort of evidence do we have besides just the documents and the letters? Or is there any more? I
mean, you get this feeling that he was simpatico to women. You get the hints of his manners seem to have appealed to women. I don't think he was friends with women like Atalanta Baglioni, Leandra de Iodi. These were patrons who were supporting him as he's trying to play the patronage game, as I like to call it, to advance his career, to get to where he wanted to be. In terms of Urbino, I would think yes. And the other question, Graziella's question, was about the authenticity of the so-called Giovanna letter, which, if it is real, if it really was written by her in 1504, talks about affection for him. I don't want to go on the limb and say that it is real, but the language is absolutely typical of letters of the period. And so that really bespeaks love and affection. And you know, Raphael went back and forth from Florence to Urbino and Perugia in that so-called Florentine period. And he's documented in Urbino a few times, mostly about real estate kind of things. But he grew up in that courtly ambience. He would have known these people and these women. He may have been there around the time that the Book of the Courtier is set. And so I think that with the Urbino women, that probably there was some kind of an affectionate relationship, less the kind of business relationship, say with, you know, with Atalanta Baglioni or something like that. And then thanks to the work of Alberto Maria Sartore, we know that the relations with the nuns of Monteluce became more and more contentious over time. You get a new abbess in there who's not going to put up with stuff from Raphael's heirs and their lawsuits about it. So, but I think that for the Urbino women, that yeah, that there probably was some kind of real bond of comedy, if you will.
That's a great way to conclude, I think.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Cheryl, for this beautiful lecture.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you to everybody for attending.
Sorry for rushing at the end.
Thank you very much, Sheryl, for this wonderful and fascinating presentation and for guiding us through this very interesting perspective on Raphael's work and context. Thank you very much, Lia, also for your moderating the talk today and for the cooperation between our institutions that will for sure go on next year and in the future. I would also like to take the opportunity to encourage everyone to keep on following the Italian Cultural Institute in North America, as next year we will all together again celebrate Dante with a series of lectures and events on the occasion of the 700th anniversary from his death. And as we move our attention to, we can start actually moving our attention to Dante, starting next week on December 17 with Paola Nasti's lecture organized by the Newberry Library, dedicated to the triumph of love, the passion in the Divine Comedy. What a better way, no better way to end the year. And you can find actually the links here on the chat right now. And also we have, I think, the link to the webinar as was the first post of the chat. So that said, I would like to thank everyone who attended, which I'm sure enjoyed. Grazie. And wish everyone happy, or at least peaceful and healthy holidays, and a better year, at least, that will hopefully see us again, meet each other again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Grazie. Is it possible to look at the chat? I see that there are all of these.
Yeah, we'll keep it on. People can continue to write, and I will also save it.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
This was really a pleasure, and I'm sorry I rushed at the end, which always happens. I'll take a quick look at the chats now. Thank you. Are you guys going to stay for a couple of minutes after All right, let me take a quick look and scroll. Oh my goodness. Lot.
I need to stop
Da,
this.
da, 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 da. Christy, Rolf Quaid now.